How were heavy elements like carbon, nitrogen, copper, and gold created? All heavy elements were created inside of stars, or when stars exploded. How do stars form? Stars started forming after the intense heat of the Big Bang cooled, and cold hydrogen gas began condensing into large mass objects due to gravitational attraction. How was our moon formed? An ancient planet the size of Mars hit the Earth, and the ejected material subsequently coalesced to form the moon. Our understanding of where the water that fills the Earth's oceans came is still of some scientific debate, but most scientists currently think it was likely brought to Earth by comets. If you scaled the Earth down to the size of a beach ball, how thick would the ocean be? About 0.1 millimeter. How quickly did life appear on Earth after the Earth cooled and the oceans filled? Remarkably quickly, less than 500 million years. When did life on land first appear? 550 million years ago. Which animal group represents the first appearance of a backbone that evolutionarily led to you? The first vertebrates were fish. What is the nature of the earliest known fossil? A chemical fossil. When did life on Earth transition from being just simple prokaryotic organisms floating around in the ocean to more complex eukaryotic organisms? About 2 billion years ago. Which came first, evolution of bacterial photosynthesis and the associated production of oxygen, or the evolution of multicellular organisms? Evolution of bacterial photosynthesis and oxygen came first. What was the Cambrian explosion? An event in Earth history where most of the major animal phyla were created in a relatively short period of time. What is the geologic age period of the rocks around Ithaca? Devonian. Which type of crust is denser? Oceanic crust. What evidence did Alfred Wegener use to confirm that the continents had drifted over geologic time? Fossil and mineral belts on separate modern-day continents, aligned neatly when the continents were artificially moved into a single supercontinent. Why was extensional faulting along the axis of mid-ocean ridges an important piece of evidence leading eventually to the development of plate tectonic theory? Because extensional faulting occurs when solid rock is pulled apart. What kind of tectonic process takes place in deep-sea trenches? This is where old oceanic crust is sinking back into the mantle. How are continents moved around on Earth over geologic time? Continents are moved when the tectonic plates that they are a part of move. Which geologic feature is a result of oceanic crust colliding with continental crust? Andes Mountains. Why is the age of continental crust so much older than the age of oceanic crust? Ocean crust is constantly being made at mid-ocean ridges and then recycled back into the mantle in subduction zones. How were the Hawaiian Islands created? Mantle hot spot that upwelled magma to the surface to form underwater mountains that eventually grew to become islands. Where are siliceous and calcareous oozes typically found? All of the above. Analysis of fossil shells in sediment cores extracted from the seafloor can yield information about all of the above. Which wave process gives rise to the nice clean sets of waves that have similar wavelength that come ashore in Hawaii from Alaskan storm? Wave dispersion. What typically happens to wave energy as it approaches a coastal headland? The wave energy is focused to produce larger waves. If you are caught in a rip current, what should you do? Swim along the shore for 10 to 20 meters, then back to shore and then call Bruce. What is a storm's fetch? It is the distance over which the storm is able to recover energy lost to viscosity forces. How fast does the tsunami wave propagate? About 500 miles per hour. What should you do if you were somewhere near a beach and suddenly felt a small earthquake? You should move immediately to higher ground or a tall building. In the video of the Japanese tsunami propagation across the Pacific, which best expresses how the wave propagated, many individual tsunami waves spread across the Pacific forming complex interference patterns. Which force is involved in the creation of the tidal bulge located on the far side of Earth opposite the moon? Centrifugal force. What orbit path does the moon take around the Earth? The moon's orbit around the Earth is at a 28 degrees inclination relative to the equator. When do spring tides occur? During a full moon. Why do we get rotary tides? The combination of Coriolis force and blocking by continents. Why do you not get a significant tidal range in Hawaii? Hawaii is near an amphidromic point. If you have high pressure at 30 ON and low pressure along the equator, why do surface winds turn westward? They are turned by the Coriolis force. Does the mixing depth of the surface ocean get shallower or deeper from winter to summer? The mixed layer gets shallower as the surface layer warms. What is Ekman transport? The movement of a thin slab of surface water in response to wind forcing. How is the mound of surface water in the middle of the subtropical gyre formed? Trade winds and westerlies drive Ekman convergence. What drives subtropical gyre rotation? A center of high pressure under a mound of water drives currents outward deflected by Coriolis. If winds blow north to south along the west coast, would Ekman transport be onshore or offshore? Offshore. How is the age of bottom water measured? Based on 14C concentration. How long does it take for deep ocean water to move from the North Atlantic to the North Pacific? About 2,000 years. The reason oceanographers care so much about the movement of the conveyor belt circulation is because it moves a lot of heat from the equator to higher latitudes. Which statement best describes concern about AMOC collapse? Scientists have modest but growing concern. What happens to the Walker circulation during El Niño? The Walker cell slows down or reverses. What happens to the warm pool during El Niño? The warm pool propagates from the western Pacific to the eastern Pacific. During an El Niño event, productivity off California increases. False. How are El Niño effects transmitted globally? Variation in the position of the jet stream. What happens to global average temperature during an El Niño year? Global temperatures increase during an El Niño year. With regard to the global carbon cycle, how do ocean photosynthesis and respiration compare to human emissions? Ocean respiration and ocean photosynthesis are each much larger than human emissions. Net primary production and photosynthesis are equivalent terms. False. Which light level produces zero net primary production? Compensation light level. Which type of phytoplankton has growth advantage at low nutrients? Small cells. Which nutrient limits phytoplankton growth in the Southern Ocean? Iron. Why is primary production higher in the eastern equatorial Pacific? The thermocline is shallower. Why do coastal upwelling regions experience seasonal productivity? Because the winds driving upwelling is seasonally variable. Where is the critical depth relative to the compensation depth? Deeper. If phytoplankton mix below compensation depth, NPP will be negative. True. Why should you thank the ocean for every other breath? Because primary production in the ocean constitutes about half of global primary production. Which region comprises most global ocean primary production? Open ocean. What does size-structured pelagic ecosystems mean? They mean that body size is the dominant factor that determines what trophic level any given animal species will reside in. What is exploitation efficiency for small grazers in tropics? Exploitation efficiency is high. Given 10% trophic transfer, how much fish from 1,000 phytoplankton? 10. Where is harvestable fish production greatest? Coastal region. What do heterotrophic bacteria use for energy and carbon? Dissolved organic matter. Prochlorococcus contributes more than a quarter of global production. True. Where does the biological carbon pump operate most efficiently? In eutrophic regions. What determines species position in rocky intertidal? All of the above. What happens to biodiversity when pisaster is removed? Biodiversity decreases. What is a trophic cascade? It describes the alternating decrease-increase-decrease in the abundance of organisms in adjacent trophic levels. What caused kelp forest declines in California? Sunflower starfish decline due to bacterial disease. What percentage of coral nutrition comes from zooxanthellae? 60-90%. What resource is in short supply on coral reefs? Space. What happens when reefs are overfished? It reduces herbivory on macroalgae and allows the macroalgae to overgrow and smother coral species. How much coral cover lost over past 150 years? 50%. What percent coral lost at 2°C warming? 99%. What fossil feature links Pachycetus to whales? Earbone. When should you visit Hawaii to see humpbacks? Winter. Which noise source most concerns whale populations? Commercial shipping. How often do offshore oil air guns blast? Once every 10 seconds for several months. What other ethical issue exists with whaling? The extraction of a common public resource from the ocean for commercial profit. What property allows hydrogen bonding in water? The polar charge distribution, with one side of the molecule having a slightly positive charge and the other side having a slightly negative charge. What forces determine water phases? H-bonds and thermal kinetic energy. Why does ocean temperature rise less than land? Water has an exceptionally large specific heat capacity. Latent heat transport by water vapor is true. True. What determines surface salinity? The difference between evaporation and precipitation in the region. Where is surface salinity lowest? Subpolar North Pacific. What happens to nitrate moving Atlantic to Pacific? The concentration increases. Why is oxygen high in upper ocean? Both and B. What causes oxygen minimum zones? A. High level of microbial respiration, fueled by dead organic material raining down. Why does deep ocean oxygen decrease Atlantic to Pacific? Microbial respiration along the 2,000-year journey from Atlantic to Pacific. Why is CO2 low in surface ocean? Photosynthesis in the surface ocean. How much CO2 has the ocean absorbed? About 30%. Ocean surface is 60% more acidic than pre-industrial. False. What happens if deep water reaches surface acidity? Acidity of the surface ocean will increase. Oyster aquaculture will be impacted within 2-3 decades. True. Why are polar seas especially vulnerable to acidification? Cold water can absorb more CO2 than warm water. When will polar seas become corrosive? 20 to 30 years. Will ocean acidity remain elevated for 10,000 years? True.